Well, hello again. Welcome to another episode of Sermon B-Sides. My name is Rusten, and I'm one of the pastors at coramdeo Church. I'm here joined with Pastor Jon. Hey, Jon, what's up?
What's up, Rusten? It's Monday afternoon after election week, and everything is clear and settled now.
Everything is clear and settled. I don't have a question in my mind about what's going on in the world. Everything is, it's like a clear, sunny day. In fact, I'm looking at the window right now, and it's nothing but clear. That's a little more accurate.
I was going to say, it looks cloudy and cold. It was 34 on my walk this morning. So
Yeah, I did do something fun yesterday. I started up for the first time my wood stove. So
wow, the first one of the season.
First one of the season. I usually do it a little earlier. In fact, I think that the whole election stuff and the craziness of this year just put my mind in such a funk. I didn't realize what month it was, I guess, because I was in the car with Brenna a couple days ago, and I was like, doesn't it seem really, really cold for this time of year to you? And she was like, Rusten, it's November. And I was like, oh my word, it is November.
What happened?
Why haven't I been running the wood stove? So, well, thanks for joining us. We do got to do a couple things at the beginning of every one of these episodes. And today is special because we're talking about sex and slaughter.
Woo!
So what are those couple things we got to do at the beginning of every episode, Jon?
First thing is like and share this. We know a couple of you are watching, and if you like it and share it, it helps get the word out. And it's a practical way to say you appreciate what we're doing. So take a moment now to like it, and you can pause it and share it right now and then come back. All right, we'll give you 3 seconds. 1. Good. Okay, thanks.
All right. And what else we got to do, Jon?
We have to share what we're drinking. Got to introduce our bourbons or whiskeys or spirits.
Yes. So what do you got today?
Well, I told you it was a curveball.
Okay, what is that?
This is something that's been sitting on my shelf for 2 years.
You must not like it very much. Just joking.
I have not opened it.
Oh, wow.
The first time I've opened it.
Oh.
It was left behind at a Christmas party 2 years ago. And I just overlooked it. And so I'm opening it today. Are you ready?
Ready.
Gentleman Jack.
Gentleman Jack, a mini bottle.
I'm going to drink the whole bottle on this episode.
It's a little gentleman.
It's a wee little one.
It's a wee one. That's good. I mean, Pastor Brandon likes Gentleman Jack, and
Jack and coffee and everything.
And I can remember having it at his house once, and I do remember really enjoying that one. But I haven't had it probably since then. All right, here's what I got. This is the very first. This isn't itself the very first bottle, but this is the very first Scotch I bought.
Quarter cask
Lafroig.
Oh.
And this is probably I've had this particular bottle for probably over 3 years now. But the very first bottle of Scotch I bought was Lafroig quarter cask, and I had no idea what I was getting into.
You're like, Scotch is Scotch.
Okay, Scotch, okay. And I was like, oh my gosh, people drink.
What did I buy?
Yeah, but it's one of those things, we talk about peaty Isla Scotches and how there's this kind of like conversion moment that happens to you.
Yep.
If you're one of the chosen. And where I think that you described it once that you had it one night and then the bottle was or it was like somebody brought it over, left a bottle at your house, and you thought it was terrible, but the bottle happened to be empty when it was finished or something like that. And then you smelled the bottle in the garbage can, like, oh, I kind of want some, right?
Yes.
After already saying you hated it and never wanted to try it again.
Yeah.
Similar experience with this. Quarter cask, I really like it. It's got a super peaty, but because it's quarter cask, it's a different kind of a peat. Like it basically can get the same age quality out of a quarter cask,
right,
for a short amount of time. So your peat,
because you have less fluid in it.
Yeah, because there's more surface area on the barrel, so you get there's something about the quarter cask where you get a different kind of a peat note than you do in like a 16-year Lagavulin. And I think that that peat note is more fresh. That's how I would describe it. But
Yes, Lafroig is in my opinion, a more punchy
Mhm.
Islas. Lagavulin seems a little more nuanced. Ardbeg and Lafroig are a little more
Yep, yep.
punch in the face.
This a fun fact. If you buy an Isla, almost 99% of the time, it's in a green bottle. Who knows that?
Let me look at my stash. That would be true.
And the reason for that, you know why?
I'm. It has to do with the light.
It's because they don't want you to judge the strength of the Scotch based on the color.
On the color.
Because if if you're used to some whiskeys that you enjoy, a lot of times you'll see a heavier, darker one and put in your mind what that's going to taste like in terms of intensity. It's darker. But a lot of Islas are very light, and they don't want anybody to think this is a light flavored whiskey because it's light in color. And so they started putting them in green bottles. I read this forever ago. I hope it's still true.
I thought it was maybe like if you had some buddies over and you were having a lot of Scotch and it got to the point where you couldn't read the labels, you could tell which was the Isla and which was the Highland.
That one's got a green tint to it. Yeah, so I love this whiskey. It's good. I haven't had this in a long time. It's 48%. It's very rich. It has an odd sweetness to it, and then it's punchy in the face with peat and stuff. So, all right.
That at my house is frog water.
Oh yeah, yes, frog water, roof runoff. Moss tea.
I love it.
That's good. Well, we are talking today about everybody's favorite subjects, which are based on the 6th and the 7th commandments. Thou shalt not kill, and thou shalt not commit adultery. Right?
We didn't want to be controversial, so.
No, I mean, we prefer softballs to hardballs to needing a new metaphor.
quick.
So sex and slaughter. So the first, I think it's one of the things that I really appreciate when you went through both of these commandments was that you talked about how they both celebrate something. Mm-hmm. The commandment to not kill and the commandment to not commit adultery. And so you gave a really clear, because the commandments are negative, right? But every negative commandment assumes a positive as well. And so I think that sometimes, I think it's really important to focus on that because we oftentimes can get in our own minds so focused on the negative aspect that we forget the vision that the commandments are giving us of life and of beauty. And so I thought it'd be kind of fun to just talk about for a little bit, what is the beauty and the good life envisioned by these two commandments? And another question we'll get down to later is how are these two commandments connected to the commandments that have gone before? But but just in a nutshell, sex, thou shalt not commit adultery, thou shalt not kill. What's the beauty envisioned in these commands?
Yeah, one of the things I've been doing, I think for the last couple of weeks, has been like asking people to like imagine what does a world look like where people take these things seriously. And with these two, it's very easy to like imagine that, like a world where there's no murder. So like you said, like, you shall not murder sounds like such a negative, and it is positive negatively, but there's a beautiful vision behind that, or a world in which, there is no adultery. And think about just all of the downstream cultural, societal effects of adultery, of unfaithfulness, of not just broken hearts, but broken families. Think about the emotional pain that comes with that, the economic reality that's associated with that. There's so much. And so you have this vision of a perfect world, a beautiful world. In that world, there's no death, there's no adultery. But in the you shall not kill command, it's an inescapable value that's there. And you have the affirmation and the celebration of human life. There's a value in human life to be cherished and honored and embraced and acknowledged by all people. And that goes just all the way back to Genesis, where we read that human life is not an accident. It's not the byproduct of chance and time and just the right amount of this and the right amount of that bumping into each other, over eons of years. And it's not that. Human life is the result of God. God makes humanity. He makes Adam and Eve, and unlike the rest of creation, Adam and Eve and all human beings are made in the image and likeness of God. And it's a really fascinating thing to think about. We get caught up with the beauty of creation. So there's a, Ridgetop, which is the road, just down the road from the church. You're going over Ridgetop Boulevard and you see the mountains and they've got a fresh layer of snow on it. Like there's something awe-inspiring about that. I personally love the mountains and snow, so anytime I get to be in the mountains and the snow, it's just, I get filled with wonder. You can look at incredible animals that have either like crazy strength or just the weirdest looking, beautiful power. We get caught up with all of that kind of beauty, and as beautiful and majestic as those things are, none of those things bear the image of God. There's one thing in all of creation that God made to bear his image, and that is human beings made male and female in his likeness. And so in that commandment, you have, in the sixth commandment or sixth word, you have the affirmation of the intrinsic value and beauty of all human life without exception.
There's I think there's a quote by an early church father. I can't remember if it's like Tertullian or Irenaeus, but somebody once said, "The glory of God is man fully alive."
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
who it was, but that's kind of what you're getting at. There's a, when God creates everything and says it's good, it's when he creates man and woman that he says it's very good, right?
Yeah.
And that's the pinnacle of his creation. There's a beauty vested in humanity that is unique in its divine origin and its divine value, and that's affirmed in this commandment. And it's interesting because that's so contrary to a lot of the rhetoric around humanity that sees us as like we're a scourge upon the earth, right? We are a parasite, as it were, right? What a different world that the scriptures give us in terms of our role and our place in it and our calling in it, right? There's a massive amount of dignity there that we totally that the rhetoric of materialism just totally forsakes and doesn't even have it in the wheelhouse. Like there's, like in their mind, right? And their how they would think about things, they would go so far as to think of humanity primarily as a parasite, or like what's really wrong with the world in terms of, and maybe there's some theological truth there, right? When we think about is done to the world. But
Romans 8, the creation is subjected to groaning, not because of its sin.
Yes, but that's a theological and sin problem, not a ontological problem, not a problem of who we are as beings, like So that's that's what are you gonna say?
I was gonna say there's something. You talked about people seeing human beings as a scourge, and I think that the further out someone looks, the easier it is to maintain that worldview, perhaps. But the closer in you look, like nobody looks at their family members. That, And one of the things I think is really interesting, and specifically about this command, is that I think there's, especially right now, at this cultural moment, we want to say life matters, and specifically, people are saying Black Lives Matter.
Yeah, sure,
right? And we should affirm that Black lives do matter because they're made in the image of the triune God, right?
Yes.
I think there's something kind of written in the soul or on the soul of each person that wants to believe that a human life matters. And the challenge is that you cannot consistently maintain a secular, humanistic, or at the core an atheistic worldview and then have any rational reasoning for why a human life matters, because those worldviews don't allow for any meaningful explanation to the unique intrinsic value of human life. You have to look somewhere other than atheism to answer that question.
Yeah, and atheism usually ends up producing weird variations of which human life matters.
Absolutely. Yeah, because the answer that they have to come up with, that they can't say that human life matters because it's made in the image of God, and they have to find another reason that it matters, and that reason is usually a functional, pragmatic reason.
Yep.
So in Nazi Germany, certain lives did matter,
Yeah.
and certain lives were unworthy of life, and there was a criteria, right?
I think that was actually a phrase, life unworthy of life.
Right.
The phrase used to describe. Did you mention that in your sermon? I think
I did. Yeah.
That's the road you go down when you lose the biblical doctrine of the Imago Dei. You are, generations, if not decades, away from affirming something along those lines that doesn't value humanity. I think that in some ways today, you see that even popularly through the way that people talk about, population control, or you have individual families, or not families, sorry, you have people that are married who will say, oh, there's no way I'm going to ever have a kid because I don't want to birth them into this world. I don't want to burden them. I don't want my children to be a burden upon the world, or whatever, right? I've read people that say that. So that devaluing happens in different ways.
I love it how every person who says that is a walking contradiction and a hypocrite.
I know there's anybody who argues for population control, you kind of have to ask the question, how serious are you about this?
Yeah, are you willing to lead by example?
Yeah, and I hope you're not.
And I hope not either, right?
Let's talk about the Imago Dei and why you ought not to lead by example here, and why you got to forsake this godless doctrine. Yeah, so there is a positive vision of life, the beauty of life, of human life made in God's image. And I think that kind of flows into the next commandment about adultery. What's the beauty and vision by that command?
Yeah, so again, I asked, like, try to imagine a world in which there is no adultery, right? And all of the, downstream effects of that. But the positive, the affirmative, what's assumed behind that command is the beauty and the glory of sexual fidelity within marriage.
Yeah.
People who make promises and keep promises. And I would argue that while the commandment identifies adultery, under that, I would say fornication would be part of that as well, meaning sex before you're married. But the commandment is specifically dealing with you're married and you're engaged sexually with somebody who's not married. That is a covenant breaking act.
Yep.
And we see God made us to be covenant making people. That's what happens in marriage, to become one. That covenant is to be consummated and cultivated and celebrated and reaffirmed. That's what sex essentially is. Yeah. And to violate that covenant is to lie about God. God is the covenant maker. We're made in his image. We're made to make covenant and keep that covenant. And when we break that covenant, we're lying about God. We're saying God doesn't keep his covenant either.
Yeah. So there's a kind of going deeper into that idea of the glory of God as human fully alive. There's a kind of display of the covenant keeping God in our sexual lives and relationships with our spouses.
Absolutely.
It is that beauty on display, and that beauty, it's a beauty that is fruitful and that it actually produces life.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
And there's within this command, there's captured so many different positive envisioned understandings and perspectives on the beauty God's made. And one of them, the gift of, you mentioned in the sermon, the gift of gender, right? The gift of what God made is in his image, male and female, he created them.
Yeah.
And then the gift of the union and joy of marriage, and then the gift of family that comes out of that, right? They're all, every one of those things is like an absolutely beautiful gift that God gives.
Yep.
And I think that you have to start there before you get into the what's happening when it's broken, right?
Right. Absolutely.
You only know what you lose when you when you know what the value of the thing you lost.
Yeah, and think about this in terms of like analogy between marriage and God who keeps covenant, right? Because we know in Ephesians 5 that there is a direct picture between the God who keeps his covenant through the sending of the Son and his love for the church and the love that a husband and a wife have. So think about this for a moment. We're made in the image of God. God, the triune God, creates life, and that expression of creation is an overflow of the love that flows between the persons of the Trinity. When a husband and a wife enter into that dance, when they mimic that, when they give covenant to one another and enjoy that covenant and celebrate that covenant and are engaged in in sexuality, it also overflows into the creation of life. There's a direct correlation between those. The love of God leads to creation. The love of a couple also leads to creation.
It's when you were talking about how making that connection that the Bible does about the link between a husband and a wife and Christ and his people, right? There's I was thinking, you for some reason that reminded me of that book and movie, The Giver.
Yes.
Because I was thinking, so what happens if you live in a culture where the family is no longer a thing? A husband and wife are no longer a thing, right? You have, in The Giver, you have birthers, right? You have birth mothers that are just used for birthing and feeding the community with new members, right? There's no actual family. There's no actual husband and wife scenario. There are instruments of the state to take care of kids.
Yes.
In that world, is the gospel itself of Christ and his love for his people as tangible, or did you lose language, right?
Yeah.
Have you lost language to make it tangible, if that's where your mind goes, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
There's a link between life. Like, a lot of people want to say, like, stick to, a lot of Christians will say, stick to preaching the gospel. Don't get into all these social issues. Yeah. But you realize that those two things are deeply connected.
You'd never read Paul and come to that conclusion.
No. Why? I mean, but it's interesting when you start to think about the ramifications of losing this understanding. And I actually don't really believe it's possible to entirely lose it, because it's just built in. It's like God made it this way, right? I think in that regard, The Giver is a bit of a fantasy world. The world may try to kill this thing out, but God will never let it, because it's hardwired in. But it's interesting to think about the paths that the world goes down to kind of undermine God's design for marriage, right?
Yeah.
How when you do that, if you support that, right? If you as a Christian support that while saying, well, in my opinion, right? Yeah. In my opinion, that's not the best thing, but I want to support that, right? What you're actually doing is you're saying, I support the undermining of the language that makes the gospel tangible.
It's self-sabotage.
It is, and it's lying.
There's something about so we know from Psalm 19 that God made the world to speak to us.
Yeah.
The heavens declare the glory of God, the skies proclaim the work of his hands. That's true all the way through. It's not just like the stars up there and the big mountains and the seas, and then God quit doing that at the micro level. God speaks to us through creation. God speaks to us through this. And one of the most profound ways that God speaks to us is through family.
Mm-hmm.
God speaks to us not just in terms of information, but it's about proximity. It's about tenderness. It's about care. It's about love. It's about forgiveness. All of those things we learn in the context of family, from mom and from dad.
Yeah.
And so you cannot substitute that learning experience. You cannot bypass it. You can't get around it. God has hardwired us to learn about him first and foremost in the context of a family, in the context of the home. And that's one of the reasons you were, I think, kind of scratching at this earlier. That's one of the reasons that the more godless a society becomes, the more antithetical and militant that society comes against biblical marriage and biblical family. That's why communism wants to do away with the family.
Yep.
The family speaks about God. That's why liberalism wants to get rid of marriage, because marriage speaks about God. It's not coincidental that darkness is always going to mount an attack against the fundamental spheres and relationships in which we are most prone, most sensitive, most able to learn about God. And that's the home, that's family, that's marriage. And if you ask what culturally has been under attack in our country, that's it.
Yeah.
And people need to wake up and connect the dots and realize, oh, this isn't just random things that liberalism is like deciding to kind of rail against.
Yeah.
This is a systematic attack on the fundamental spheres, relationships in which God reveals himself through, in which he nurtures and cares for people, which is family.
Yep. There'd be no surprise if someone was to hate God's word and what he says to do. Like if someone says, like, I don't believe in that I'm a sinner and need Christ. I hate God's word. I want to disregard it or say that's nice for you. It would be no surprise that same person would also hate the words that he's speaking to us in our sexuality and in our marriage and whatnot.
Yeah.
So
I was years ago, I was driving around and happened to come across a talk show on 107.7 The End, and it was Adam. Was it
Adam Savage?
No, who's the? Sorry, it was Dr. Drew.
Oh, okay.
It was Dr. Drew, and it got me listening. And he made this comment that I was like, "Gosh, you sound an awful like a Christian," but he said, "Nature doesn't like promiscuity."
Mm.
And I'm like, okay, I'm listening. Go ahead. And so he basically unpacks it, and he says, if you find one partner of the opposite sex and you give yourself to that person, your bodies are going to flourish.
Yeah.
The moment you start violating that law or that principle, when you have multiple partners, right, bodies do not respond on a physical health level. It doesn't go well.
Yeah.
And the reason for that is because God made our bodies to be given to another person, and for that to be life-giving and joy. And when that's violated, there's a hardwiring in creation.
Yeah.
That, when we violate God's law and design, we unleash chaos at every level.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. There's a it's funny you say that, because I was reading a book. I think I've done some Facebook posts on it by Rod Dreher. Called Live Not by Lies. And it kind of like, it's a fantastic book. I really recommend people read it, because it feels like it kind of helps you get a grip on what's going on in Western civilization right now in ways that helpful, because it looks at some trends historically and applies some of that thinking to our context and to understand what's going on. And one of the things that he talks about in that book is like talking a lot about what happened in the Soviet Union and the rise of communism and whatnot, and totalitarianism, which totalitarianism is just the idea that everything in your life becomes politicized, which I think that it's fair to say that there's more and more of our lives is becoming politicized, right? We're not living under an authoritarian government yet, more and more so, but that doesn't change the fact that more and more of life is becoming politicized, which is the beginnings of totalitarianism. Yeah. And one of the things that was super interesting was he's talking about the build up to the rise of communism was Russia had been in a state of nothing quite like it before sexual decadence. Right? Like they were like in the book he says something along the lines of, you think that they were more dark, that they really followed Darwin, but what they really followed was Marquis de Sade. Like they were celebrated sexual deviancy to a level that was not at that point in that culture, had never gotten there before, culturally and enshrining and celebrating it. And that led, that's the condition, that was a condition for their the personal slavery of sexual sin led to and was deeply connected to the actual political slavery that was to come.
Yeah, and you see that's what's happening in the giving of the law, right? Because you have the slavery in the rear mirror, and whenever God says, "Don't do this," we need to hear Him saying, "Because that brings slavery. I just got you out of slavery. I just rescued you. Right? Don't worship other gods. That leads to slavery.
Yeah,
go down the list, and don't commit adultery. Don't violate the biblical sexual norms, because to do so is to submit yourself to slavery. And that slavery, so what you're saying, or what Dreyer's getting at, and what you're arguing for, is that slavery has no limitation to its jurisdiction.
Yeah.
Right? It just grows and grows and grows, and you end up enslaved as an entire culture.
Well, I think that you see this happen in small scale in families too. When the father of a household is addicted to pornography, what is that? What does the entire aroma of that household happens, right?
Yeah.
What happens when that infiltrates the small government of family government, right? And when men are addicted to pornography, you don't realize how much it's forming you into a kind of person.
Yes.
It's forming you into a slave.
Yeah.
Forming you into a person that relates differently to your wife and to your kids and everybody, right?
It rewires your brain.
It rewires your brain. There's a really great book, I forget the guy who wrote it, but called Wired for Intimacy. And I think it was put out by IVP. Man, I forgot the name of it. Go look it up. Wired for Intimacy. And he talks about the formative nature of pornography and sexual license, and how much it shapes you into a certain kind of person. And it's very and this is unlike murder, which is ubiquitous in some ways. I think this issue, pornography, is ubiquitous in violations of the seventh commandment are ubiquitous in ways that unlike, I think that everybody has either themselves or known someone who has been affected by the slavery of pornography, right? It's everywhere, right? And it's becoming more and more accepted. And I mean, we're in Washington State, and did that have to happen first? Did the whole culture have to become kind of like into this before referendum 90 passed? Like, is that the stepping stone that leads to the point where we're teaching kids, different, at what age? I don't know what age they're teaching, but the Ref 90 in Washington passed, and it's basically it's a new sex ed curriculum that is far deeper into the explicit and deviant understandings of sexuality than we've quite seen in public school before. But that didn't come out of nowhere.
Right. It's progressive. And I think you bring up pornography.
It's progressive.
It is progressive, right?
We're going somewhere, but we don't know where we're going.
Or maybe they do.
Off a cliff.
Yeah. So once you have, things like breakdown of the family, once you have the normalization of pornography, it doesn't end there. Like, even you could look at like TV 20 years ago and TV that was on last night. And what was on last night would have been unthinkable for many people 20 years ago. You have the boundaries and the restrictions keep getting pushed forward. So once you have the normalization of pornography, then you're going to have the normalization of, of adultery. You're going to have all sorts of sexual deviancy. Now you have the normalization of homosexuality, the normalization of transgender. And one of the things that's going on right now, and this also applies to the issue of abortion. So I don't know if we'll get to that later.
Well, that was kind of, this is maybe a lead-in question to this, but the question is, I have down here is, what's the relationship between these two commands? Like they're connected, obviously, right?
Yes.
So go on. You probably answer that with this next comment.
Well, I was going to say we're in a situation now in which things like sexual immorality, so specifically same-sex marriage, homosexuality, casual sex, transgender, the whole thing, right? And along with that, abortion, are no longer considered gray areas. It's now, if you oppose those things, you're immoral.
Yes. Yeah. They must be affirmed.
They must be affirmed. And I think a lot of Christians, like well-intended Christians, are missing what's happening right now. We're no longer saying, is this an acceptable option for someone to do? It's not that. It's become a creedal thing. If you don't affirm this,
love is love.
You're right. Yeah. If you don't affirm it, you are morally wrong. Like I heard Patty Murray made a comment. She's one of the senators for the great state of Washington, about if you even question the morality of abortion, that you are far right-wing, crazy whack job. And I think people don't understand that the left is not arguing as if this is a debatable thing. It is, you approve this, and if you don't approve it, something is morally wrong with you. And that is setting up a very dangerous scenario if that keeps playing forward, and I have no reason to believe it won't keep playing forward. But you asked, what's the connection between them?
Yeah, because I think that we're scratching the surface of something that's there's a deep connection between those two things.
Yeah, so there is an intrinsic connection between sexuality and murder, and transgenderism and abortion. And that trend is that they are both violent attacks against the human body, which God made.
Yeah.
And they are attacks against the human body in ways that some of the other commandments aren't. So this week we'll be looking at not bearing false witness against your neighbor, right? That's something that you're really doing with your mouth. But murder and sexuality are things you're doing with your entire body. And when you violate those commandments, it's not just your body that's involved in it, but it's also a violation of somebody else's body. Yeah. And those are bodies that God made. He made them for a purpose. He made them for a reason. God made us male and female. Those are gifts. God didn't ask us for our input on that. We're to receive those realities as gifts. Transgenderism is violence against the body God gave us. Abortion is violence against the body God gave us. Both of them are an act of rebellion against flesh.
It's interesting that you use the word violence, because I think that that's a word that really does capture what happens with a transgender transition. You are literally mutilating the body that gave you, that speaks to you about himself.
Absolutely. I might date myself here. Are you old enough to remember people objecting to circumcision?
I can remember there being an episode in a TV show I used to watch where I think it was Seinfeld or something, where somebody was there was like protests against circumcision. Yes. Why would you want to mutilate a body? Yeah, exactly.
Really?
Yeah. I know, and there's one of the things that came up in our God and Government conversation was kind of about these two topics in one of the Q&A questions, and how, scripturally speaking, if we look at what the word says in terms of punitive response within God's people to these sins, murder deserved murder, murder deserved death penalty,
Capital
right?
punishment.
But capital punishment, but the capital punishment also was in the law for specific other sins tied to treason, which is we even have had death penalty in our country for things tied to treason, right?
Yeah.
So
Yep.
treason, homicide or murder, but also sexual sins, sexual violence, sexual deviations, and kidnapping. Those are if you go and look at the categories, they all fall within those four buckets: sexual perversion, murder, and treason, and kidnapping. And under treason is kind of a catch-all because God was king, right? So there's those categories aren't so far off from us. But one of the things that I think that you have the whole question of what does that look like within the Old Testament covenant people of God versus today. And I think that Christians should and can affirm that while there's the penalties were tied to that civil government that God established with his people, but we absolutely with our civil government in our context should see that if we have any opportunity to influence our government, that we not promote these things at all. Because I don't believe God arbitrarily assigned a death penalty for these things. He did it because he knew they led to a death of a people, a deterioration and an enslavement of a people. Yeah. And if you love your neighbor, you should not want that for them. And so there's a connection, I think, in how we think about these things in our public life, that I do think that a lot of Christians are just so willing to think that, well, you do, we're okay promoting this so long as we personally don't agree with it.
Yeah, there's one of the things that I've heard, I'm sure you've heard, and if you're watching this video, I'm sure you've heard or said or felt or thought, is that isn't all sin? Yeah. Why are Christians so concerned about this one thing? Like, don't you lie? Have you committed lust in your heart? And the really quick way to reveal that somebody actually doesn't believe that is to ask them, would they prefer to have a liar or a murderer as a neighbor? Yeah. And the answer is, well, a liar. I was like, I thought sin was sin. And what they'll immediately realize is that, okay, all sin is a violation of God's holy law and warrants a just punishment, and that punishment is death. But not all sin affects a culture or society in the same way. And the Levitical code, I'm thinking specifically in Leviticus 18, is really helpful to give us a sense of sins that are absolutely corrosive and destructive to a society as a whole. And so, for example, you have, murder is to be responded to with capital punishment, because when you take a life, your life is forfeit. When you violate the image of God in another person, you forfeit your own life. Yeah. This is also true in Leviticus 18 of all sorts of forms of sexual immorality. And it's not funny, but you think about, like, why does Leviticus have to talk about homosexuality and lesbianism and bestiality? And the answer, because people do it. Yeah. Because it's in the sinful, wicked heart of human beings to do these things. Yeah. And when God says, under that old covenant, in that theocracy, that these are not just sins, but crimes that are to be met with the death penalty, one of the things that we need to hear is that this is exceptionally destructive beyond the individual that's participating in it. This is corrosive at a societal level, and any culture that is indifferent to this, is in big trouble. Yeah, and I can't help but think that even during that time, right? If your law says if your law says that this deserves the death penalty, how many times do you think that actually gets prosecuted, right? And I'm like, I can't help but think
Very rarely, because no one's, there's no, for instance, there's no instances of that in the Old Testament of anybody being prosecuted for that.
Yeah.
But it sets a tone for a people. And if God's setting a tone for a people that it leads them into flourishing, and that tone says, do not tolerate this among yourselves, because it does not lead to flourishing.
Yeah.
There's a which the tone that our culture is set, though, is so shaped by the absolute opposite of the biblical vision, and it's sad. And this should shape the way we think and love our neighbors, because our neighbors have bought into a vision of life that have bought into a vision of life that does not lead to the flourishing that Christ gives us, that picture of beauty we started with at the beginning of this episode, right? Yeah. And it reminds me of, I think that so much of what's shaped the way we think about this is shaped by Freud. Freud basically, a huge part of his whole theory was that sexual repression, right? So the norms that say that these things are dangerous and are bad and don't do them, those norms, whether that's, be faithful to your wife, or don't have more than one partner, or taboos around, homosexuality and stuff, all those things were really causing this repression that was like the chief psychological problem of mankind.
Yes.
And so what do you do? What do you need to do? Well, you need to have a revolution, right? And so we have, we're still living in what I think is like the middle of a sexual revolution to overturn those things. And has it led to peace? Has it led to, people having less anxiety and less psychological problems? Yeah. Are we not living in the most psychologically problematic time that's ever there's just more? Is there not more depression than
if you could somehow chart and look at how should I say this? The more that sexual norms are kind of unhinged and unhitched, right?
Yeah.
If Freud was right, what you would see is that as a culture becomes, according to a Christian understanding, as it becomes more sexually immoral, it should become less depressed, less anxious, less addicted, more liberated, more flourishing.
Yeah.
But what we are seeing is the exact opposite. In fact, as you're saying that, I'm like, what are the cities that are like the bastions of this sexual morality? And, you think about like Seattle, you think of Portland, you think of New York. It's like, how are those cities doing right now?
Yeah.
And it's like, I look at that and I go, this is what happens.
Yeah.
Once you start throwing off like norms and rules and law, like we've said before, it's Christ or chaos.
Yeah. And sadly the false gospel that's being believed is the false gospel of someone like Freud, right? Mm-hmm. And rather than leading people into the liberation of freedom that comes in Christ, it's leading to slavery, and that should break our hearts. In fact, I think that's probably where we should kind of end this episode. Is maybe, John, what's a word to someone who is in the grips of sexual slavery, in terms of an addiction? What's the word of Christ to them that they need to hear?
I think you have to start with the gospel.
Yeah.
And you have to start with Christ came, he suffered, he died. He's not waiting for you to clean yourself up. He has pursued you. He has suffered on your behalf. You have to know that in your darkest moment, in the pit of despair, in the midst of addiction, there is a God who loves you immensely and has given of himself to not only forgive you for what you've done, but to renew you into the person he made you to be. And you have to start there, because once you understand that that's who God is and that's what God has done, that opens up the door to trusting him with what he says about your sexuality.
Yeah.
The God who tells you what your body is for is the same God who suffered and died for you. God is not at all interested in limiting our joy or our freedom or our human experience. All of his laws are given to protect and cultivate the fullness of human joy, but that's not going to be found outside of relationship with him. So you have to start with forgiveness, and you have to know that the God who is giving these instructions is the same God who laid down his life. And for those of you who are in the midst of addiction, you just need to know there is resurrection power in Christ. The Holy Spirit can and will set you free from desires, from addictions. That doesn't mean that will be automatic, although sometimes it is. But it does mean that as you struggle against addiction, you're not struggling with your own power and with your own strength, but with the resurrection power of Christ in you.
That's good.
There's hope. There's nothing but hope.
Nothing but hope. And in Christ. And I think that I'll add one other thing, which is, to me, has been when I think about this issue and the anxiety around it, and not just simply around sexual addiction, whether that's pornography or other forms of lust, but also in terms of the captivity that people find themselves in and buying into a version of sexuality that has become for them an identity. If the gospel is true and what Christ tells us is true, then that person is ultimately restless, and they know it. And when I hear people talk about this, I hear it in their voices. There's a restlessness in that. There's a kind of constant anxiety and restlessness that is outside of Christ. And the words of Augustine always come to mind here, which is his prayer, which is, "O Lord, you have made us for yourself, and our hearts are restless until they rest in you."
Amen.
So anyways, we hope you enjoyed this episode of Sermon B-Sides. Not a light topic at all. If you have any questions or you want to reach out in any way, feel free to go to slido.com, put the event code in, coramdeo. You can add a question in there. You can also send an email to just pastor, PASTOR, at coramdeochurch.org if you have any questions or, you want us to follow up on anything from this episode. So anyways, thanks for joining us, Jon. Yeah. As usual, it was a joy to talk with you, and we hope you guys have a good one. Until next time.
All right.
B-Sides. See ya.
See ya.
Bye.